So welcome everyone. We've been listening to British Iraqi poet and rapper Low-Key. That song was called Terrorist. It's a question mark with a question mark, and it's from his soundtrack. It's from his album Soundtrack to the Struggle. So my name is Suzanne Baustad, and I'm a Red Sparks Union member, and I wanted to welcome everyone to our first public forum on the criminalization of people's liberation movements and our call to scrap the terrorist list. It's our first public forum, but we did run this forum last night in Surrey, about 22 hours ago, but we're really excited to be here with you tonight. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting tonight on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Stolo nations. These territories have never been ceded to the Canadian state through military defeat or treaty. And we know that the land we're on has come to be known as Canada and British Columbia through a process of dispossession, displacement, occupation, and the genocide of the Indigenous peoples of this land. And we know that the liberation of all peoples on this territory is intimately linked to the liberation struggles of the Indigenous peoples of this land. So we're honored to have with us tonight the hereditary chief of the Innistoten hereditary chief and spokeswoman, Frida Hewson. She's here. She's not going to be speaking, but I did want to make sure that she was welcomed. And we have with us speaking as the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief, Togastai, who will be updating us on what's happening at the Innistoten camp, which is about, I think it's about 1,000 kilometers north of Vancouver. That's about right, in the Peace River region, yeah? Since July 2010, the Innistoten has been successfully blockading 7 oil and gas pipelines from encroaching on their traditional territories. We also want to acknowledge tonight the continued breathtaking bravery that we've been seeing today. The Mi'kmaq warriors who are, as we speak, facing down the RCMP to stop the thumper trucks trying to look for shale gas on Elsipogtog lands. Both of these struggles represent critical forms of strategic resistance to the pipelines and the natural resource extraction that will drive Canadian capitalism and colonialism for generations to come. And I just wanted to invite Ianis to grab the bucket. He was going to make a solidarity fundraising pitch for these two struggles.
Okay. So we're probably going to pass the bucket again later in the event, but we do want to give people the opportunity to provide some very real and meaningful support to groups in our country, in Canada, that are being faced with being labeled as terrorists or disruptive or criminal, and are just in the process of defending their own traditional territories and lands. So we're going to pass the bucket from the back and invite people to make a contribution to those struggles if you would like to.
Thanks, Ianis. We would also like to welcome other liberation movements into this room, and we've put some banners up, including a banner right there for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, one of many Palestinian liberation organizations currently on Canada's terrorist list. So Red Sparks Union has formed in the past year as a means to defend and support liberation movements here and around the world. We saw reactionary states the world over, including Canada, and sometimes especially Canada, attempting to use anti-terrorism as yet another way to attack and marginalize people's liberation movements, and especially those fighting for the liberation of oppressed and colonized nations. While counterterrorism measures have been widely criticized for attacking Canadians' individual civil liberties, it was clear to us that it's been people's liberation struggles here and around the world which have been criminalized, and anyone involved with them branded a terrorist. Over the past 2 decades, and especially since 9/11, we've seen the effects of pervasive counterterrorism laws and labeling on individuals, on communities, and on anti-imperialist and revolutionary organizing in Canada. First, we've seen the intensification of state surveillance and the use of force against Indigenous land and water defenders, when those that exercise their sovereignty and stand their ground are branded as terrorists. We've seen a narrowing of support for Indigenous struggles to those that primarily use legal or symbolic tactics, which, while important, have proven to be quite limited. Second, we've seen that people with any links to liberation movements are being excluded from and removed from Canada, even if they've lived here for a very long time and are permanent residents. Immigration and refugee laws deny refugee protection, permanent residence, and sometimes visitor visas or even study permits to those believed to be associated with so-called terrorist groups. Even when those revolutionary groups, like the FMLN, resisted one of the most brutal regimes on this continent and has now been voted into power by the people of El Salvador. And I'm just referencing the brave fight back of Jose Figueroa. Jose was a student activist against the US-backed right-wing government of El Salvador that slaughtered 80,000 of its own people in the 1980s. Even though he's been here for 16 years and all 3 of his children have been born here, Jose is now being branded a member of a terrorist organization and is facing deportation and separation from his family and community. Jose remains in sanctuary tonight, fearing an arrest warrant, despite a federal court decision that he can't be removed from Canada until after his appeal is heard in January. So when we're talking about the Canadian state's treatment of those they believe to be terrorists, I also would like to remember the name of Hussein Bhujani. He's a 31-year-old Kurdish and Iranian refugee whose body was found about a year ago on the train tracks at Commercial and Broadway. He was labeled a terrorist by the Canadian government, and his refugee claim was held in suspension for many years. I wanted to remember his name because in a final act of the Canadian state's dehumanization of those they've labeled terrorists, Hussein's body was held in a morgue for 3 months and then buried in an unmarked grave in Surrey, despite the fact that the government knew he was very much loved by many in the Kurdish and Iranian communities and those involved with Kimbrace, which is a refugee organization in East Vancouver, all of whom wanted to give him a proper burial. And when we're talking about Canadian state complicity in state terrorism, I want to remember the name of Sathya Aservatham, or otherwise known as B16, according to the numerical system given to the 492 Tamils who arrived on our shores aboard the MV Sunsea in August 2010. As you'll recall, the Canadian government made a very loud, very public point of labeling everyone who came on that boat a Tamil Tiger terrorist and detaining them like criminals. There's many in this room who did amazing support work from the BC prisons where they were held, and just so you know, there's still 2 in detention. We know that 2 Tamil migrants from the Sunsea have now been deported. B5 was immediately detained by Sri Lanka's anti-terrorist security forces known as the CID at the airport and has since disappeared. Sathya Aservatham, or B16, was deported in July 2011. He was met at the airport by CID and held for a year, and then finally released when his family could come up with a large enough bribe. After he was released, Sathya did an incredibly brave thing. He swore an affidavit for his Vancouver lawyer to give to Canadian immigration to try to stop the further deportation of Sunsea passengers to Sri Lanka. In that affidavit, he told of the torture he endured over that year in detention and ended by saying, "I think one day they will kill me." We know that one day in November 2012, Sathya was called in for questioning by CID, and there he was confronted by Sri Lankan authorities as well as 2 CBSA officers. That's 2 Canadian immigration enforcement officers. They questioned him about his affidavit in the presence of his torturers. In September 2013, Sathya was killed when he was hit by a truck. People in the Tamil community he was living in say it was murder. So we know there are real consequences when the Canadian state labels someone a terrorist and then deports them back to states whose anti-terrorist measures include disappearance and murder. So we'll be touching on immigration and refugee laws because we know that they're a primary counterterrorism tool used especially in Canada. But I also wanted to let you know that Red Sparks Union hopes to do a future forum to focus more in depth on this issue. So we know that imperialist wars and occupation have always brought revolutionaries to these lands, despite the laws and labels at the border. But what we're seeing more and more is the use of anti-terrorism as a familiar form of social engineering, where the state decides not only which communities can establish here, but the class and political composition of those communities. Red Sparks Union has decided to hold this as our first public forum because we're seeing that the fear and state sanctions inspired by repressive anti-terrorism laws have created a chill that undermines solidarity within and between communities, and it undermines our ability to build the kind of movements so needed in Canada at this time. So you only have to scratch the surface of this country's history to understand that the best of our struggles have always been led by and inspired by revolutionaries from oppressed and colonized nations. And many of us in this room know that in our own experiences. For example, many of us, I can see very many familiar faces. We know each other through working or meeting at La Cana, which was a worker-run community space on Commercial Drive that was opened by Chilean revolutionaries in 1983 and came to be an important space for anti-imperialist and radical politics in Vancouver for almost 2 decades. And many of us who call ourselves anti-imperialist feminists have learned our politics by grouping with women, critically engaged with liberation movements, and in particular national liberation movements in the Philippines and Palestine. And Charlotte will be talking about the US case of Palestinian-American Resmia O'Day, who's a 65-year-old feminist, activist, educator, and community leader, come on in, who now faces 10 years in prison and deportation from the United States because of her involvement with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Red Sparks has summarized our position on the need to scrap the terrorist list into 5 reasons. And that 5 reasons leaflet is on the information table outside there. I think you'll get the gist of the 5 reasons from our speakers tonight. I also wanted to invite everyone to check out our information table, which includes information here on liberation struggles in Nepal, in the Philippines, and there's some more up there on Palestine and upcoming events as well. I think we have a sign-up sheet for Red Sparks as well. So if you're interested in future events, please sign up. And you can also find out more on redsparks.org, or we're on Facebook as well. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel of wonderful speakers, the ones that are on time. Charlotte Cates is an organizer with the Boycott Israeli Apartheid campaign, BIAC, and Samadoun Political Prisoners Network. She has practiced as a lawyer in the United States and is a member of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee. There's our speaker. Come on in, Carrie. I was just going to introduce you. That's good. Carrie Coast, as she walks in, is a journalist, dramatist, and activist from BC. She has recently served as a representative for the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities at various UN forums. Her recently published book, The Colonial Present, The Rule of Ignorance and the Role of Law in British Columbia, is about the ongoing process of colonization, criminalization, and forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples in BC. And as I was saying, we're very honored to have with us tonight Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chief Togastai from the Unistoten Resistance Camp, which has been on the front lines of Indigenous land defense in this province for the past 4 years. Prakash Pio is a Tamil human rights advocate and political activist based out of Toronto. In 2008, he was part of the York University Tamil Student Association executive that fought for and won recognition of the Tamil Eelam national flag as the legitimate national flag of Tamil students, which was a global first in academic institutions. This political activity, combined with participation in a student-run campaign advocating for the human rights of Tamils in Sri Lanka, was the first time he was labeled a terrorist sympathizer by the Sri Lankan state and investigated by Western security services. He is currently on the executive committee of Basics Community News Service and a community organizer with Radio Basics, the May 1st Movement, and the International League of People's Struggles in Toronto. Khalid Barakat is a Palestinian activist, journalist, and writer based in Vancouver and well known to many in this room. His writing on current events and Palestinian issues is widely published in the Arabic media. And Jeff Shantz is the last speaker that's still
on his way.
He's on his way. Some of us aren't on capitalist time, that's what they say. He's a professor in the criminology department at Kwantlen Polytechnic, a member of the Critical Criminology Working Group, and an editor of the journal Radical Criminology. I think they're going to bring some copies with them. And he's also a former member of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. So without further ado, I'll start and get Charlotte to kick us off here.